"You're nothing but a gardener," the socialite's voice echoed through the immense hall, like thunder splitting the sky in a stillness. The sentence seemed simple, but it carried a subtle venom, the kind that not only hurts, but leaves invisible scars. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Everyone stopped what they were doing, glasses raised, eyes averted, laughter interrupted. It was as if the world had been frozen, just so that sentence could be recorded in the air. And there he was, in a simple uniform, his hands still covered in dirt, as if he'd just come from a flower bed. His expression, however, wasn't one of submission or shame. On the contrary, there was a disconcerting firmness in his gaze, something that didn't suit the role of mere employee. This contrast alone was a spark of mystery. Who was this man who wouldn't bow, even though he was dwarfed by so many witnesses? At that moment, unbeknownst to anyone, a much larger story began to unfold. And it wasn't just a disagreement between a boss and employee. It was a silent battle between two forces, the arrogance of those who believed they had the world at their feet, and the serenity of those who carry a secret that could turn the tables. Have you ever stopped to think how certain words reveal more about the person who speaks them than the person who receives them? The socialite, surrounded by luxury and sycophants, believed her voice was law, that she could label someone and reduce their entire existence to a function. But can a person's true worth be measured by their profession? How many times have we seen someone underestimated simply by the clothes they wear or the work they do? The curious thing is that in that room, where the glitter of crystal chandeliers and the clink of champagne flutes reigned, no one imagined that the gardener was not who he seemed. It was like watching a play where everyone knew only half the script. The other half was about to be revealed, and when it did, it would change not only that woman's life, but everyone present as well. And that's where the real twist begins. Because sometimes a phrase born from a scornful impulse becomes the spark that ignites a revelation. A seemingly small detail can become the thread that pulls the whole thing together. And you, who are following this story now, will see how a single misplaced word can change destinies. If this introduction has already made you curious, take the opportunity to leave your like right now, because what comes next will completely change your perception of power, respect, and justice. She didn't need to say her name to be recognized. In the most exclusive circles in the United States, her mere presence was enough to turn heads and change the tone of conversations. Tall, always impeccably dressed in imported pieces, accustomed to traveling on private jets and dining in restaurants where the price of a glass of wine could sustain an entire family for months. This was her reality, or at least the reality she insisted on displaying. But behind the exaggerated shine of diamond necklaces and the artificial laughter of those who'd never known the weight of accumulated bills, there was something many preferred to ignore, the arrogance that oozed from every gesture. To her, people were like rungs. Some served to support, others to be stepped on without guilt, and in this social game, she always considered herself at the top of the ladder. It's curious how society glamorizes figures like this. How many times have you heard stories where ostentation is seen as synonymous with success? But should success really be measured by designer handbags and lavish parties, or by how we treat those who have nothing to offer us? The socialite believed that respect was directly linked to purchasing power, and so every glance she cast carried a silent judgment. His friends were handpicked, not for character but for last name or bank account. His home was the stage for events where laughter was loud but hollow, where applause was frequent but mechanical. Anyone who dared to deviate from this standard of luxury was immediately ridiculed or worse, ignored as if invisible. It was precisely in this context that the gardener appeared, And here's the point of turmoil. Amidst so much luxury, the man's simple figure seemed a deliberate contrast, almost as if fate had decided to place side by side the ultimate symbol of arrogance and the silent representation of humility. And if, at first, he seemed out of place, everyone would soon realize that it was the socialite who was in the wrong place, holding a false crown that wouldn't withstand the slightest hint of truth. You, who are following along, can probably already imagine the depth of the fall when the pedestal crumbles. But before that, we need to better understand how the unlikely encounter between these two very different worlds came about. He appeared almost as if he didn't want anything. A simple man in a worn uniform with a hat that hid part of his face, and his hands scarred from work. To any casual glance, he seemed nothing more than another gardener hired to keep the flowers that adorned the mansion alive. But there was something different. It was the way he walked, the firm gaze, the posture that stood out from the other employees. He didn't bow, didn't avoid staring, didn't seem to carry that air of submission the socialite so desperately hoped to find in those who served her. From the very first moment she met him, her arrogance was evident. She didn't ask his name, didn't want to know where he came from. For her, simply labeling him gardener was enough, and that was enough to reduce him to an unimportant role. But what was most intriguing was the calm with which he reacted. No forced smile, no attempt to please. Just silence and attentive observation, as if every word spoken in those rooms were being carefully stored. Have you ever noticed how sometimes the quietest people are precisely the ones who see the most? While everyone laughed, toasted and talked about luxurious trips, that man seemed to study every detail. He was like a chess player who, before moving the first piece, surveys the entire board. This was completely at odds with the role he'd been assigned, and this discrepancy, though almost invisible, already indicated that there was much more hidden behind the discreet figure. The contrast between them was stark. On one side, a woman accustomed to being revered. On the other, someone who seemed unconcerned about being ignored. This difference, so subtle at first, would be precisely the engine that would rock the entire structure of that life of appearances. Because, as you well know, it's not noise that brings down, but strategic silence that prepares the way. And then comes the burning question: who, after all, was standing before the socialite? Some gardener, or someone who, behind their simplicity, hid a power greater than she could have imagined? Before that answer is revealed, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel, because the story is just beginning to turn upside down. What follows will show how her pride became her own trap. It didn't take long for the trigger to light. A trivial detail, an unimportant conversation, was enough for the socialite to publicly display her contempt. Surrounded by guests, she raised her champagne glass as if lifting an invisible crown and, in front of everyone, repeated the phrase that had already echoed like a sentence: "You're nothing but a gardener." The ironic laughter that followed came not only from her, but also from some of those present, always ready to applaud the cruelty of the powerful. It's curious how people, when they believe they are superior, forget their principles and align themselves with the strongest, as if dignity were a currency easily exchanged for status. How many of us have seen this happen in companies, among friends, even within our own families? But at that moment, the focus wasn't on the laughter. It was on his reaction. Because, contrary to what everyone expected, the man didn't flinch, didn't lower his head, didn't beg for respect. He remained firm, silent, as if knowing that time would answer better than any words. And that silence, paradoxical as it may seem, sounded like a deafening scream. The socialite, accustomed to seeing others bow before her arrogance, felt something she rarely experienced: discomfort. And the more steadfast his gaze, the more agitated she became. Her wounded pride made her lose control, insisting on ridiculing as if the humiliation were a spectacle that needed applause to continue. But there, hidden beneath the mask of submission she believed existed, was something no one could have imagined. Have you ever wondered what you would do if you were put in that situation? If, in front of so many witnesses, someone tried to reduce your entire life to a label? Would you accept it silently? Would you retort in kind? Or would you wait for the right moment, letting the truth come out with the weight that only fate can bestow? What no one knew was that silence held a secret capable of changing the entire game. And when it was revealed, the phrase, "You're nothing but a gardener," would cease to be an insult and become ironic, because, deep down, what was nothing was her own arrogance. And that's exactly where the story begins to take a turn. The next chapter will reveal who this mysterious man really was and why his presence there was no coincidence. Until that moment, no one dared imagine that behind the simple clothes and work-marked hands lay a story of power and influence that would completely change everyone's outlook in that mansion. The truth was, that man was no gardener at all. His presence there was part of something much larger, almost like a silent test to measure the character of everyone around him. What few knew was that he was the heir to one of the largest corporations in the country, with businesses spread across several states, and a fortune that would make many of those invited revere his presence. But why would someone with so much power choose to hide under the guise of a simple worker? The answer is simple, and at the same time disturbing. He wanted to see who really was who. In life, it's easy to surround yourself with people when you have money, influence, and prestige. It's hard to know who would respect you if all those masks were removed. How many times have we seen stories of millionaires who lost everything and suddenly became invisible, even to those who swore eternal friendship? It's in these moments that the essence of human relationships is revealed. Are they based on who we are or on what we have? The socialite, unknowingly, had become the perfect example of how pride blinds. By treating him as inferior, she was signing her own social sentence, exposing to everyone that her worldview was limited to the glitter of dollar signs. And meanwhile, he silently watched, recording every gesture, every word, every mocking laugh. It was as if he were gathering evidence in an invisible court, where the verdict would not be handed down by judges, but by fate itself. This revelation, still a secret, had the power to turn the tables, to transform the humiliated gardener into the supreme ruler of the social empire she believed she dominated. And when the truth came out, there would be no more laughter, only the awkward silence of those who realized their mistake too late. And here's a thought. How often do we judge people by their appearance, ignoring the fact that each person carries an invisible story, capable of surprising even the most arrogant? Perhaps the socialite's biggest mistake wasn't shouting that phrase, but believing she knew someone's essence simply by their current position. The next chapter will show how this mask finally falls, revealing not only the man's identity, but also the fragility of the entire castle of arrogance he built. The room was full, the buzz of conversation mingled with the soft sound of a piano in the background, and the socialite, the center of attention, seemed to reign supreme. Until, suddenly, silence fell. It wasn't a normal silence, but the heavy kind that precedes the revelation of a secret capable of turning everything upside down. The gardener, until then invisible to many, finally decided to speak. He walked to the center of the room, his firm footsteps echoing against the luxurious walls, and calmly revealed who he truly was. There was no shouting, no arrogance in his voice, only the firmness of someone who carries the truth on his lips. The looks, previously filled with contempt, turned to astonishment. Friends, guests, even the servants watching from hidden doors and corridors all froze. The simple man, treated like a nobody, revealed himself to be the new boss, the true owner of everything. The socialite, who until just moments ago had ridiculed him, felt the ground slip from under her feet. Her champagne glass nearly slipped from her trembling hands. The phrase, "You're nothing but a gardener," echoed again, but this time like a crushing weight on her, because what was truly nothing was her arrogance. It's amazing how life puts everyone in their place. Those who applauded the scorn now looked away, trying to hide their embarrassment by laughing along. Those who had always bowed to the socialite now discreetly walked away, like rats abandoning a sinking ship. And she, who always believed she was in control, realized she was naked before the truth, without titles, without luxury, without defenses. Can you imagine the impact of that moment? Have you ever thought about how often we judge someone without knowing their true story? This scene was like a mirror held up before everyone there. It reflected not only the socialite's mistake, but also the cowardice of those who chose to laugh, rather than remain silent, of those who hid behind the power of others. And here's what I need to tell you. If this twist has already given you goosebumps, take advantage and subscribe to the channel right now. Because stories like this remind us that the world is made of twists and turns, and you won't want to miss the next ones I'll tell you about here. Also, leave a like, because what's yet to come will further change your view of justice and destiny. The revelation struck like a bolt from the blue. The socialite, who moments before had boasted the air of an untouchable queen, now found herself surrounded by disapproving glances and venomous whispers. She was no longer the powerful woman everyone applauded, but the central figure in a spectacle of public shame. What had once been admiration turned to silent judgment. Those who had flattered her began to distance themselves, as if fearing being contaminated by her defeat. It's curious to observe how quickly society changes sides. When someone is at the top, everyone wants to get close, share in the shine, and enjoy the crumbs of power. But all it takes is a fall for these same allies to become indifferent spectators or even enemies in disguise. And here's a harsh truth. Loyalty bought with luxury and status dissolves faster than ice in the sun. The socialite realized this in the cruelest way. Close friends avoided her gaze. Some people chuckled quietly at her embarrassment. Others simply turned their backs. For the first time, she wasn't the center of attention for her wealth, but rather for the humiliation of having treated someone with contempt without knowing who was really standing before her. And the gardener. He didn't need to raise his voice or resort to harsh words. His mere existence, revealed in its fullness, was enough to dismantle the entire castle of superiority she had erected. While she sank under the weight of her own actions, he remained, serene, as if silently saying, "Life always takes its toll." Now I ask you, do you think she deserved this lesson, or do you think he overreacted by revealing himself that way? This is the part where I want to hear your opinion. Leave your comment below, because your perspective may open new reflections for those watching. And don't think the story ends there. There's still one important detail: how he handled this situation after her fall. Did he let his resentment get the better of him, or did he choose a different, quieter, but much more powerful path? What many expected was a vicious counterattack. After all, after being humiliated in public, who wouldn't be tempted to return the insult with equal intensity? But it was precisely at this point that the new boss surprised everyone. He didn't raise his voice, didn't ridicule her, didn't belittle her in front of others. He simply looked at the socialite with the calm of someone who understands that life had already done its work for him. And this gesture was far more devastating than any revenge, because there is no harsher punishment than being confronted with one's own mistakes without anyone having to say a word. The socialite, in her arrogance, expected confrontation, expected resistance, but she found only silence, a silence that weighed like a sentence. It's interesting to note how true victory often lies not in retaliation, but in showing that we don't need to conform to that which hurts us. He didn't need to tarnish his dignity to prove a point. On the contrary, it was his serenity that elevated him above the situation. It was as if he were saying without words, life has already shown who is truly who. And here's a thought. How often do we insist on carrying grudges, planning sharp responses, dreaming of the day we'll retaliate against a humiliation, when, in truth, silence and indifference can be much sharper weapons, because time exposes, time reveals. Time puts each piece in its proper place. The socialite, now without applause or allies, was forced to face not only the man she had scorned, but also the mirror of herself. And there, in front of everyone, the lesson was clear. Respect cannot be bought, demanded, or imposed. Respect is earned. If this part of the story resonated with you, please like the video, as it will truly help bring this message to more people. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories that, like this one, have the power to move and provoke reflection. But before we wrap up, there's still the finale. The conclusion of this narrative isn't just about the socialite's downfall or the new boss's serenity. It's about the message it leaves for all of us, and that's what you'll hear now in the final chapter. At the end of this story, there's a lesson that goes far beyond luxury, wealth, or social standing. What we learn is that a person's true value lies never in what they flaunt, but in what they carry inside. The man who seemed like just a gardener showed that dignity, patience, and serenity can be more powerful than any fortune. And the socialite, in turn, discovered the hard way that arrogance and contempt are fragile masks that time always reveals. How many times in our own lives have we underestimated someone because of their appearance, their job, or their lifestyle? And how many times have we ourselves felt diminished by the judgments of others? This story is a reminder that each person carries an invisible story, one that can turn our perception of the world upside down in an instant. And most importantly, true justice doesn't always require shouting, revenge, or humiliation. Sometimes it comes in the silent form of dignity, in the calm of those who understand that fate takes care of balancing things out. Man has shown that it's not necessary to lower oneself to right a wrong. Life itself fulfills that role. If this story moved you and made you reflect on judgments and the true value of people, don't forget to like it now, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what you would do if you were in any of the characters' shoes. We want to hear your thoughts, because stories like this only come to life when they provoke real reflection. In the end, the burning question remains: have you ever been underestimated in your life? Have you ever judged someone based on their appearance without realizing what they truly harbor? Think about it, and remember, never underestimate anyone. Life has silent ways of teaching us the most powerful lessons.